I am Peggy Schuker, the Deputy Director of ADL New England. We and our partner and collaborator, JCRC Boston, thank you for making time to be here today to educate yourselves on this difficult and disturbing topic that is a threat for all of us and our communities. Our collective work fighting hate and extremism as we work to secure justice and fair treatment to all has taken on an urgency with the growing presence of extremist groups around the country and particularly here in New England. These groups are rooted in hateful, racist, white supremacist, and anti-Semitic ideologies. And as we will learn from our Center on Extremism expert, Alex Friedfeld, are ramping up their activities and targeting New England. It is no accident that a group named Patriot Front flew its members in from all over the country to Boston during the July 4th weekend, or that the National Socialist Club is showing up on in our Cradle of Liberty more frequently, in greater numbers, and deploying ever more threatening tactics. And most recently, our communities have been targeted by the Goyim Defense League, who disseminate anti-Semitic screeds throughout a targeted community in plastic bags filled with rocks, rice, and sometimes pennies. These groups seek to instill fear in our communities through intimidation, but acting together, we will not let this happen. A key piece of acting together is knowledge. Those who these groups are, how to respond, how to ensure community security, and how to come together collectively to call out and disrupt this hate. And in that spirit, also mark your calendars for 1 p.m. on September 14th, when ADL will offer another webinar on extremist-related activities focused on elections. We'll send you the details following this program. Now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Alex Friedfeld, who is an investigative researcher with ADL's Center on Extremism, where he monitors anti-governmental extremism with a particular focus on the militia movement and the Boogaloo movement. For those unfamiliar, a key part of ADL's work involves monitoring and analyzing extremist activities, extremists with ideologies rooted in hate, white supremacy, racism, and anti-Semitism. As you will learn from Alex, white supremacists and extremists draw on anti-Semitism in insidious ways as they recruit new members and spew their hatred. Our Center on Extremism tracks extremist trends, ideologies, and groups across the spectrum. To date, Alex has trained thousands of federal, state, and local law enforcement officers on a variety of extremism and domestic terrorism-related issues. He frequently represents the ADL on national and international outlets, including CNN, NBC, and The Guardian. Prior to joining ADL, he worked as an analyst in the New York Police Department's counterterrorism and intelligence bureaus, where he monitored terrorist activity around the world and ran terrorism-related investigations in the city, focusing predominantly on ISIS. Over to you now, Alex.
Great, thanks, Peggy. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. So as Peggy mentioned, my name is Alex Friedfeld, and I'm an investigative researcher with the ADL Center on Extremism. And we are basically the arm of the ADL that's tasked with monitoring, exposing, and disrupting violent extremism wherever we find it. And so I don't think it'll come as a surprise to anyone that we are deeply concerned by the rise of white supremacy and anti-Semitism in this country over the last few years. So what I'd like to do today is talk about that problem. First by explaining what exactly white supremacy is, then talking about a few of the groups that are active in New England, and finally by talking about kind of one of the latest iterations that we're seeing in anti-Semitism, and that is the Mapping Project. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and at the end of them, I'd be happy to answer them, and we can talk about them. So let's start with white supremacy. And talking about it in general and how it operates. White supremacy is a broad term that refers to a large collection of groups that are all animated by and large by the same ideas, right? The first is that white people should have dominance over the others because of their perceived inherent cultural and genetic superiority. This idea that white people need to establish their own ethno-state, essentially a place where they govern and rule. And lastly, that white people are facing danger of extinction due to a rising, so-called flood of non-whites, right? Essentially that this is this white genocide that is happening that is going to undermine, white power. This all goes beyond a simple racism or bigotry. It's really a way of viewing the world and what it should be. And this last point is particularly important, right? Modern white supremacy is founded on the belief that white people are on the verge of extinction. And it's important to understand that this is not a passive process, right? But one that they believe is enabled by clear villains. And those villains are Jewish people. They believe that Jewish people are undermining white lives and intentionally flooding the country with immigrants in order to explicitly decrease white power. Hence the phrase, "You will not replace us," or the more direct, "Jews will not replace us," which is what they chanted in 2017 in Charlottesville. The danger with this mentality is that white supremacists use this idea of a white genocide or extinction in order to justify violent acts in the real world. In their story, right, white supremacists are the heroes doing what they think must be done to save or preserve their race. And Jews or people of color are the ones who are threatening their future. And so any attack on them is legitimate. So as I said, the white supremacist movement is broad, but there are 6 major sub-movements, as you can see here, right? Racist skinheads, white supremacist prison gangs, religious white supremacists, traditional white supremacists, the alt-right, and of course, neo-Nazis. All of these sub-movements share a grounding in the tenets of white supremacy that I previously mentioned, but they all have different histories, cultures, tactics, and activities. What's important to remember, though, is that there are many white supremacists that are not formally part of any group. Instead, they are consuming this content and radicalizing on their own, typically via the internet. So that's broadly what white supremacists believe. But I want to shift to talk now about their messaging, because this is a key way that this dangerous ideology is able to thrive. Most white supremacist propaganda happens online, right? Where these guys are able to reach audiences in the thousands, if not even tens of thousands, really in an instant with just a few clicks and not much work, right? And this stuff thrives on extremist messaging space services like Telegram, 4chan, and Gab, right? And what it looks like is this. Highly stylized images that traffic in hate speech and encourage violence against their perceived enemies, right? And you can see with these examples, the anti-Semitism that undergirds their whole ideology, right? And the hatred that they have for Jews and their desire, their frequent expressions of violence against Jewish people. But here you've got some more examples showing what individuals that they want to target, right? Whether it's the LGBT community, so-called race mixers that they believe are race traders, interracial couples, and of course Muslim people, right? And white supremacists rely on memes like these that combine images with pithy text in order to reach their members and spread their ideas. Right? And frequently these messages will lean into the ultra violence because they know that's what is appealing to their audience. It's almost like a drug to them. So when people think of extremism on the internet, they often think of it happening, again, in those far reaches of the web, or even on the dark web, right? There's this idea that yes, it's out there, but you really have to work to find it if you want it. But the unfortunate truth is this stuff shows up all the time on mainstream social media platforms, right? So on the left, you've got an image from Instagram. In the middle, an image that was taken from Facebook. And on the right, you've got a bunch of videos on TikTok that all espouse, white supremacist ideas as well as anti-Semitism, right? And this is all really dangerous because it creates communities on mainstream platforms where it's really easy to find violent or hateful content. And then it creates breadcrumbs from one page to another on those platforms, right? Kind of building out that network. But more importantly, it is often intended to get people to move to more extreme spaces like Telegram, like 4chan, where they can really be radicalized into more extreme white supremacist concepts. But unfortunately, this stuff doesn't just stay online. It doesn't go away when you turn off your computer or put down your phone, right? It's increasingly affecting the real world. And the easiest way to see that is through white supremacist propaganda. So in 2021, we counted 4,851 pieces of white supremacist propaganda across the country, most of which of this content was put out by Patriot Front, which I will talk about in a little bit. This is actually a slight downtick from what we saw in 2020, but not by much, and it's still dramatically more than what we saw in 2019 and part of a broader surge that we've been experiencing since 2017. And unfortunately, New England isn't immune to this. And I'm going to focus on Massachusetts just kind of as an example here. Here you've got a map of all white supremacist propaganda put out in 2021 in Massachusetts. And there was a total of 272 cases across the state, which is about on par with the 206 cases we tracked in 2020. But again, dramatically up from the 149 incidents we saw in 2019. That said, this year we are seeing a sharp uptick in propaganda, as through March we've already tracked 149 incidents of white supremacist propaganda. Again, most of it the work of Patriot Front. But I want to kind of direct your attention to that red dot in the Boston area. And that dot represents a white supremacist murder carried out last summer by an individual named Nathan Allen. Last June, 28-year-old Nathan Allen crashed his car into a building in Winthrop before shooting and killing 2 Black people. Right? And during his attack, Allen actually bypassed white people in favor of specifically targeting people of color before he was ultimately shot and killed by police. Now, usually in these kinds of cases, there's some public leakage beforehand, right? Some evidence that the attacker harbored violent or racist beliefs or some negative event, that sparked the rampage. But what's remarkable about this case is that those things don't really exist. I actually got a chance to go through his social media, right after the attack, and there was absolutely nothing to suggest that he harbored deeply racist opinions or that things were going poorly for him, right? All I saw was a guy who basically looked like any other 28-year-old guy out there, right? A guy who liked to box, a guy who recently got married, so he had wedding photos up. He shared photos of rabbits. Guy had just gotten a new job as a physical therapist. I mean, really, when you looked at it, everything seemed to be going really well for him. And yet, his private writings show a person that was poisoned by white supremacy and anti-Semitism. So investigators found Allen's white supremacist and anti-Semitic rantings after the attack, as well as hand-drawn swastikas. And he apparently had a journal that he called the Allen Diaries, which is a reference to a famous white supremacist text called the Turner Diaries that depicts a violent race war that ultimately culminates in the extermination of non-whites. We don't have much information about how Allen radicalized or what he was reading, and there is no indication that he was part of any formal group. But I think that this shows the power of this messaging, right? This white supremacist content is so strong that it can convince a young person to throw away what seems to be a pretty good life in the name of white supremacist violence. So in terms of the hate groups and movements that are active in New England, there are 3 that I want to highlight this afternoon. And those are Patriot Front, Nationalist Socialist Club, aka NSC 131, and the Goyim Defense League. So let's start with Patriot Front. This is a Texas-based white supremacist group that operates across the country and fuses extreme patriotism with a neo-fascist ideology under the guise of preserving America's European-American identity. The group was founded in 2018 by a then 20-year-old named Thomas Ryan Rousseau, who helped to bring kind of this Gen Z understanding of the internet to white supremacy. And one of the things that makes Patriot Front stand out among all of the white supremacist groups is the fact that they actually try and disguise what they're about when they're in public. As you'll see in a few seconds, right, Patriot Front is known for their propaganda output, and they are by far the most prolific white supremacist group in this regard. But what's interesting about their propaganda is that they actually strip their public messages of overt white supremacist content so that it's easier for people to digest. Right, so here you've got a few examples from New England of Patriot Front propaganda taken from the last few months. And I want you to really notice how it compares to some of that white supremacist propaganda that I showed you earlier. Right, the biggest difference being that instead of including graphic or horrific imagery or tropes, right, that other white supremacists use, they instead use slogans like "not stolen or conquered," or "reclaim America," or "for the nation against the state," right, or "America's not for sale." At some points, they'll even, like you see it kind of in the bottom left, right? They'll even use the eagle as a symbol, right? A pretty American symbol. And so what happens is that without knowing the context of the group, one could easily mistake these slogans and the patriotic images for a zealous nationalist group, for example. And that's all by design. They're trying not to repel people, and they want them to get curious enough about the message so that they go online and look for additional information, right? And sometimes they'll even make it easier. They'll put up a QR code that you can just scan with your phone. That'll take you right to their webpage, right? And at that point, most of those people will click away when they see that, it's the white supremacist messaging, but others won't. And that helps them to spread their message, to gain new recruits, and to make inroads into new communities. So as I mentioned just a moment ago, right, since their founding, Patriot Front has been one of the most prolific spreaders of white supremacist content in the real world. And when you set our heat map to white supremacist propaganda in 2021, what's remarkable is that Patriot Front is responsible for 3,992 pieces of propaganda across the country, or 82% of all incidents. And you can see here from a post that Patriot Front made themselves, right, that they are targeting Massachusetts, and they've targeted Massachusetts the most out of any state between May and June of this year, right? Which means that total of 149 incidents of white supremacist propaganda that I mentioned before, that we tracked through March, is likely to surge as we continue to tabulate data and update our numbers for the summer. But it's not just propaganda that we worry about with Patriot Front. They also hold marches every few months in places like Chicago, Washington, D.C., and as we saw on July 2nd, Boston. These guys always show up in the same uniform, khaki pants, blue shirts, masks, and they use these marches as a way to sow fear in local communities, to demonstrate strength, and as propaganda to attract new recruits to their cause. Typically, these guys don't engage in physical violence during their marches. They're usually designed to just be, again, a show of force to intimidate, but that isn't always the case. So during the Boston March, some Patriot Front members scuffled with counter-protesters, and one Black man was reportedly assaulted during it. More alarming, in early June, 31 members of Patriot Front were arrested for allegedly planning to riot at a Pride festival in Idaho. And these men were caught after someone basically spotted them, loading up shields and riot gear into a U-Haul and called in a tip to the local police, right? And afterwards, a smoke grenade was recovered. But this shows kind of the importance of, again, kind of to steal the NYPD slogan, right? If you see something, say something, because you never know when it could actually end up having a positive impact on the community and avert a potentially, violent act. Of note in that incident, most of the people arrested were from out of state, which shows members' willingness to travel across the country for the event. And we know that from private Patriot Front channels that there is this expectation that if you're in the group, you will go wherever the event is held, right? Even if it means you have to traverse the country to get there. And what that means in the case of this rally on July 2nd is that likely most of the people involved were not actual Massachusetts residents. They are folks who flew in from around the country in order to be there. The second group I want to talk about is the Nationalist Social Club, aka NSC 131. This is a group that was founded in 2019 by Chris Hood. And they are a neo-Nazi group that started off as a group dedicated to covering up anarchist and gang graffiti with their own graffiti. But now they see themselves as soldiers at war with a hostile Jewish-controlled system that they believe is deliberately, again, plotting to the extinction of the white race. And so to combat this, NSC is working to form an underground network of white men who are willing to fight their perceived enemies through localized direct actions, including flash demonstrations and counter-protests. For a little while, NSC actually had chapters across the country in places like Florida, Kentucky, Texas, and Virginia. But they announced around a year ago that they were closing those chapters so that they could really focus on New England. And so to that end, NSC has small autonomous chapters in every state in the region. They don't really have a central hub, that they operate from. And as you can see here, they've had actions over the last few months in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island. That said, the majority of their activism does take place in Massachusetts, usually around Boston. As for membership, we estimate that there are between 35 and 40 members across New England chapters. And the group tends to draw from neo-Nazis and racist skinheads who previously were involved with other white supremacist groups, like Patriot Front and the National Socialist Movement. Given the number of actions that the group carries out, it often seems like there's more people, but usually it just ends up being the same people who are responsible for the different acts. They just have this willingness to kind of travel around the region in order to carry them out. Even though, 35 to 40 people seems like a relatively small group, it still represents a notable growth for NSC over the past 6 months. Events that even as recently as last fall would normally only attract 5 to 10 people are now regularly attracting 15 to 20 members and sometimes even more. Also of note, in the past, NSC used to rely on support from other white supremacist groups like White Lives Matter to bolster their numbers, but now it actually looks like they're self-sustainable and able to do everything themselves. The biggest concern we have regarding NSC is their protests, which have not only been happening at an increased rate over the last few months, but have grown increasingly aggressive. So first, starting with frequency. In the past, NSC used to hold events maybe once a month, but for the first few months of this year, we saw them up their rate of events to almost every other week. They haven't quite maintained that clip over the last couple months, but they're still making their presence known. As I said, right, though, it's not just the frequency that's alarming, but it's how they're becoming more targeted and aggressive. In the past, an NSC protest was more likely to just be them standing out front of a venue while holding signs, kind of rather static in nature. But lately, we've been seeing them get more confrontational, right, including getting in the faces of those that they consider to be enemies. So a couple weekends ago, NSC actually protested outside the Loring Greeno house in Boston, where people had gathered for a children's drag queen story hour. Members of NSC yelled anti-LGBTQ slogans and taunted counter-protesters who gathered across the street. And eventually, police arrested the group's leader for disturbing the peace. And 2 counter-protesters were also arrested on similar charges, right? And this event shows, is an example of just how the mere presence of NSC can create conflict in the area and escalate the potential for clashes. One might think that NSC would actually care that their leader was arrested, but they really didn't. In fact, they turned the whole thing into propaganda that was then passed around white supremacist circles in order to gain clout and potential recruits. Right? And this is one of the difficult things when it comes to dealing with these groups. They'll turn everything they can, even bad things, into propaganda for their use, and it makes it very difficult to deal with them. In addition to those kinds of protests, NSC does engage in propaganda posting in the real world, although this is something that we are seeing less of from them. So we found in our 2021 propaganda report, that there was less NSC flyering than the year before. And NSC actually picked up on that and used it, as praise, right? Claiming that unlike other white supremacist groups like Patriot Front and things like that, right? They're actually focused on real world action and not just putting stickers up in places, right? They're actually taking that next step to take the fight to their perceived enemies. That said, right, we'll still see them put up propaganda from time to time, as you see from these examples from a few months ago, even though, again, they're doing less of it. And often these stickers or graffiti are used to mark their territory or turf or to cover up left-wing flyers. They'll also hand out or drop off flyers like the ones you see here. The flyer on the left is one that NSC members handed out in Boston during the St. Patrick's Day parade this past year. And the one on the right was actually reported by a community member. And a quick scan of these messages sees a lot of white supremacist themes, including, white people are being replaced by minorities and immigrants, and these new populations are responsible for the cultural, economic, and historical degradation in an area. There's also a call for white people to stand up, explicitly to protect white people. The last entity I want to talk about is the Goyim Defense League. The Goyim Defense League is a loose network of individuals connected by their virulent anti-Semitism. These guys seek to denigrate Jews and spread anti-Semitic myths and conspiracy theories, like the idea that Jews control the government and the media, that the Holocaust was fake, and that Jews are responsible for tragedies like 9/11. As opposed to Patriot Front and NSC, anti-Semitism and not white supremacy is the GDL's primary mode of hate. And they say that they want to unite all races against the Jewish people. That said, their beliefs often map neatly onto white supremacist groups, and white supremacy is increasingly becoming pervasive within the GDL. The important thing to understand is that GDL is not a cohesive group like Patriot Front or NSC. Instead, it's about 5 or 6 primary organizers and public figures who are in turn supported by dozens of supporters in the real world and thousands of online followers. GDL also runs Goyim TV, a video platform that streams anti-Semitic content, and they rely on this tool to get their message out and raise money. The main thing that they do in order to raise money is they engage in real-world anti-Semitic stunts and schemes that are designed to troll Jewish people that they in turn then blast out over Goyim TV, again, in order to raise money. And this is incredibly dangerous because they have essentially monetized anti-Semitic behavior so that the more outrageous the act, the more money they can make, right? And it's easy to see how this can become dangerous really quickly. Now, GDL is most active in California, or places like California, Colorado, and Florida, but I'll talk about in a minute why they are relevant to New England. So GDL does put out anti-Semitic propaganda, and it's pretty easy to recognize their work because they'll plaster their name right, all over it. It's also going to be overtly anti-Semitic and focused on that issue. And this is in contrast to Patriot Front, which won't mention Jews and goes for that more nationalistic spirit, and NSC, which occasionally will mention Jewish people, but will focus more on the plight of the white man. GDL isn't nearly as prolific when it comes to propaganda as Patriot Front, but they have increased their output since December of last year, when their founder designated the 3rd weekend of every month for reoccurring nationwide propaganda campaigns. The primary goal of these campaigns is to attract media attention and troll the Jewish community. And as a result, the network repurposes any media coverage that they get and turns it into online content advertising the group. So I mentioned that GDL does have a connection to the New England, and the source of that is basically something that we started tracking about a few weeks ago, which is that one of the leaders of GDL, John Minadeo, and a few other GDL supporters traveled to New England in order to meet up with NSC. And here we've got a photo from that meeting. Now, this meeting isn't a surprise. And the reason for that is GDL is gearing up for one of their, what they call Name the Nose tours, which is basically when GDL actors from across the country gather in one area for about 10 to 15 days and engage in a series of trolling stunts and propaganda distributions, again, typically targeting Jewish people. They've held 5 of these tours over the last couple of years and are planning a 6th that will likely take place in Boston, as you can kind of see at the bottom left, though there is a small chance that they go to New York City instead. As you can see, these tours have grown since they started in September of 2019 with only 4 people. And the last one that they had last October had 24 people. And here you've got some photos from that last Name the Nose tour, which again took place in October in South and Central Texas. They did things like demonstrate in front of the ADL offices, as well as synagogues. They did banner drops, they spread propaganda, they did, deeply offensive impersonations of Jewish people, and all around they were just awful people. But again, the whole point of this is monetization. Every little thing that they do gets turned into content for Goyim TV, right? So all of that stuff that I just described, they were filming all of it and blasting it out all over their channels so that viewers could, enjoy the ride. And they hoped we'd give money, right? And basically what they'll do is they'll try and get a rise out of people any way that they possibly can in order to make that big splash on camera. In the hopes that viewers will donate, right? And what sells is confrontation, be it with Jews or minorities. And again, that's a really dangerous incentive structure and one that could get, ugly really quickly. And again, they're all about making money. You can see kind of the anti-Semitism on the bottom left. They've got a whole merch shop where they will sell really horrific T-shirts that are anti-Semitic in nature, again, with the point of cashing in on anti-Semitism. So the last thing I'd like to talk about before we take some questions is something that many of you may have already heard about, and that is the Mapping Project. Just as a quick summary, the Mapping Project is an interactive online map that pinpoints the physical locations of Jewish communal and other community organizations in Massachusetts, many of which essentially make up the infrastructure of the Jewish community within the state. The map's lines extend outwards to any group, organization, educational institution, or government official those community organizations may have interacted with. According to the creators, this is their attempt to expose and isolate those that they believe are responsible for the so-called colonization of Palestine and other perceived harms that they believe are linked, like oppressive policing, American imperialism, and displacement. In fact, they say that they want to, quote, reveal the local entities and networks that enact devastation so we can dismantle them. In total, about 500 organizations are named in the Mapping Project, and it includes a wide range of actors. Unfortunately, we don't know who is behind this project, but it's alarming because it engages in age-old anti-Semitic tropes. These include a disproportionate focus on Jewish groups, while ignoring that other groups have similarly shown support or have ties to Israel. They're also spreading the idea that the mainstream Jewish community is toxic to society and responsible for many of the world's ills, even going so far as to accuse the Jewish community of white supremacy. Even the imagery that they use, right, of these lines drawn between entities and actors, nominally, to connect allegedly oppressive or harmful Jewish institutions, is something that has been used over the course of history in order to turn the public against Jewish communities and present them as this kind of, nefarious actor that's responsible for bad things. And lastly, this whole story plays into the classic anti-Semitic trope that powerful and wealthy Jewish people have an outsized impact and influence on global affairs, essentially that they are able to manipulate the world to achieve, their objectives. But beyond being anti-Semitic, right, it is deeply dangerous because it frames the Jewish community as malignant, explicitly calls for its dismantling, and provides people with the information that they need to locate Jewish institutions if they decide to take this call seriously, right? And amidst the surge in anti-Semitic activity that we've been experiencing, this is a very disturbing development. And so in light of this, we encourage everyone to review their communal security preparedness measures. And if they need updating or need to be created in the first place, right, you can always contact the CJP's Communal Security Initiative, which will provide professional security advice that's explicitly tailored to the Jewish community. We encourage everyone to report anti-Semitic incidents to us so that we have accurate data to better inform our understanding of the threat. And then we can therefore use our voice to advocate for better policy solutions in order to address this. And lastly, obviously, if you fear for your safety at all, please do contact 911 and get help. Again, there is the potential here that Jewish people can be targeted, and we want to make sure that that doesn't happen. So that was a lot of depressing stuff, but I'd like to wrap up just by talking about things that people can do to kind of deal with this. And one of the first things and easiest things that could be done is to go online to our website and sign the petition to support the Protect Plan. This is basically, I think, a really cool program that basically recognizes that there is no silver bullet for dealing with extremism, including white supremacy, right? That it is really, if we're going to deal with this issue, it is going to take a multifaceted, all of society approach to address it, right? And so there's a few different tenets in it. Some of the key ones are just the simple fact of prioritizing domestic terrorism as a threat. and making sure that the agencies and organizations that are helping to deal with this issue are well funded and have the resources that they need to be effective. Another cool thing is putting increased pressure on social media platforms to ensure that they are not, they don't become platforms or microphones for hate and extremism, right? I think all Americans have the right to feel safe on the internet, right? To know that the spaces that their children, their families, their community are exploring online and engaging with online are not not also, places where they could be exposed to violent or hateful content that could in turn radicalize folks to embrace extremist ideologies. And another thing is just, investing in countering violent extremism, right? Counter messaging program. As I, showed you early in the presentation, extremists like white supremacists rely on messaging in order to reach new people and expose them to their ideas in order to, ultimately gain recruits. And so with better funded counter messaging, we could potentially counter those efforts and prevent people from becoming radicalized. The second thing is, again, as I've just mentioned in regards to the mapping project, is to report any hate crime, discriminatory incident, anti-Semitic events, really any problematic incident in your area, so that we have the best data possible, so that it will not only better inform our efforts to address the solution, but inform our lobbying of other entities to make sure that there are proper policies being designed to address this issue. Another thing is to make sure, to call out extremism in your own life, right? And we have resources online that are designed to better inform folks about what it is that's happening, whether it's, backgrounders on extremist movements, or a glossary of extremist related terms, or a hate symbols index, right? 200 different symbols that are associated with hateful ideologies that you can kind of look and use to better inform yourself. But the fact of the matter is that hate festers in darkness. And if we're going to counter it, it's going to take all of us, with one voice speaking out against extremism in our lives, in our local communities, to ensure that it's not able to get a foothold and spread. And lastly, if you're interested, reach out to the New England office to see if it's possible to join our fact-finding committee. This is a really cool program that we offer where volunteers from local communities are able to help us at the Center on Extremism, kind of process all of the hate and extremism that we're seeing online. The fact is we are drinking out of a fire hose. There is, and being inundated with extremist content. And while we are absolutely building tools that are making us more efficient and effective in terms of digesting all this content, there's always opportunities to help us to go through it. So whether it's listening to extremist related podcasts in order to hear what various folks are talking about, or things of that nature, we could always, we'll always appreciate some help when it comes to this sort of stuff. Anyway, I will stop there. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to take them. There's few enough too. If people just want to unmute, that's fine.
Alex, maybe just to raise one question. Should people think about showing up as a counter protester? Is that a dangerous thing to do? Do you have any advice on what's an effective way to show that a community is against this type of hate?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So counter protesting is very important in terms of, again, showing that a community is united against whatever hateful actions are taking place. But I think it's very important to be safe while doing so. These individuals could potentially be dangerous. And so we don't necessarily recommend doing it, but if you are, make sure that you are going with a large group of people, that you have a large community that is willing to stand there and do so, and be cognizant of your surroundings, right? Do not get too close where they could potentially harm you. Work with local law enforcement and things like that to ensure that everyone is safe. But it is very important to speak out with one voice against this stuff to ensure, to send the message to these folks that that the local community will not stand for hate and extremism in their area, but just make sure you are doing it safely.
Thank you. I see we have a question about how other organizations can partner with the Center on Extremism. And I guess I would extend that to our regional office as well, but I'll let you start with an answer.
Yeah, I mean, we are always looking for partners. We try, we obviously have a large platform, but the best way to maximize our reach and to spread our message is to work with other organizations. So if you are interested in partnering with COE, with the ADL, please do reach out to Peggy at the New England regional office. She'll be able to kind of connect you with the relevant folks to make sure that we can get something going.
And just to build on that, there's a lot of work that takes place even within our regional office that we would love to partner with people and other organizations with. I put my email right in the chat, so feel free to reach out directly and we can talk about how you can get more involved. The more voices that rise up together to say this is not acceptable, the better. So I know we have a fairly small group today, and Alex has covered a lot of information in this webinar. As questions may occur to you even once it's over, we are very willing to entertain them. Just reach out. You have my email. And in the meantime, we are really grateful that you made time to attend this webinar. Together, we can speak out and disrupt this kind of hate. But only if we have the knowledge to recognize it and know how to do so. So we will be in touch with you with the details of our September 14th webinar. And as a final point, I can't emphasize enough how important it is for each of you to report incidents that you see in your communities. Even something that seems as innocuous as a sticker from Patriot Front or a flyer from the Goyim Defense League. We want to know about that because we count it, we analyze it, and this data and analysis is used to make the case that this sort of hate is a problem and needs to be addressed by our officials. Very easy to do right on our website. So thank you again. Thank you, Alex, for sharing this information with us. And thank you to those who attended for making time for this important work.
Thank you, everybody.